his story wasn't known anywhere. It was just kind of intriguing, and that kind
Okay.
of just started off, just trying to find out more. And it
And
was just like,
you wrote a book about it before the podcast? Is that right?
well, there was originally in
The secret.
2015, late 2015, RTE said, because I've been lucky enough to do some work with the guys there who were amazing on some
Yeah.
docs, and
Yeah.
they said, listen, if you can bring your recorder with you and take a couple of months on it, see what you can find, and then stuff started to emerge, and then we said, right, we'll try and do a one-off doc on it. And then off the back of the doc, a publisher in England gave us a shout and said, would you do a book on it? And that nearly killed me, but we did that anyway. And
So was the podcast that we're listening to, that was the Nobody Zone, was that released after the book that you're talking about?
yeah, so this
Yeah.
is kind of the third installment, and probably the most comprehensive. There's been kind of two goes at the Kelly story before this, and yourself with podcasting now, it's become this thing of kind of serialized programs and people enjoying listening to stories in that way. And
Yeah.
the Kelly story, the Kelly story was so big that we felt, people in RTE felt it could be, an episodic thing, not a one-off. And
when you started on podcast one in the current series, so the most recent series, were you conscious of what was going to happen by podcast 7 or 8 or whatever the end was?
I suppose we had a good handle on it, but no, I mean, it's been a feature of the Kelly story that it's just one of those stories that keeps on giving. We've been back in Leash, and again, don't
Yeah.
want to be kind of spoiling it, but
Yeah.
we've been back doing kind of archaeological digs on, sites in Leash and stuff, trying to work out if there might have been kind of bodies buried there. I mean, stuff like that, totally unexpected.
What? Yeah. Okay. So I don't think we're good. Again, we're just presuming that the listeners have listened to the most recent podcast. Obviously, they haven't listened to the new episodes. But if there is bodies in Leash, is that's when he was a child? Is that right?
Yeah, or I suppose they could be in danger of giving away stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But he left Leash when he was an adult. And is there any possibility that he could have done some bad stuff here in Ireland before he left?
Yeah, I think I mean, he did appear in the Central Criminal Court in Dublin even before he got to England, so he was on the radar of the guards at home. Now, he didn't appear in court for, on charges of manslaughter or murder or anything of that nature, but he was known to the police in Dublin, yeah. So, I mean, and that's always been, one of the kind of intriguing questions about Kelly, if he committed all these crimes and attacks in London,
And again, if he did something in Ireland, and if he was that way inclined in Ireland, it kind of suggests that the alcohol and for want of a better word, the mental instability that he had, and the homelessness and the hard times he had in England, that was kind of looked upon as like maybe he lost himself a bit, he lost his mind a bit, and maybe that's why he did bad stuff. But if he did bad stuff in Ireland, that suggests that maybe he was capable of doing that without the alcohol or without the hardship.
Sure. And I think like probably the biggest challenge of the story, or it's probably better to call it an investigation, and there's it's not just me, there's another 7 or 8 people kind of working on this Nobody Zone as well, all behind the scenes, researching, going through archives, and I'm just fortunate that I'm kind of the front man kind of out there with the microphone. But I think
sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I think it's just really, you're trying to go back into an investigation of crimes from a period when things weren't digitized.
Yes.
Record keeping isn't what it was.
And people in the force could do more than they do now as regards, baiting lads in cells and stuff.
Yeah. So So there's all those it's that kind of fogginess, which is, I suppose, very much part of the story and trying to figure our way through it.
And did you find there was a reluctance from the establishment, in the present establishment, in the Metropolitan Police Force, to give you stuff?
I think initially, I think there's stuff going to be coming now in the next two installments of the Nobody Zone, which probably will change and challenge people, I guess, in some respects, about how the British police kind of conducted their investigation into Kelly. So yeah, it's probably no point going into that now at the moment. So,
and of course, a huge part of the podcast was the ex copper who had written a book about it, and that interview that you did with him in the cafe where it got kind of awkward.
Yeah, Jeff Platt was his name. Yeah.
So so for our listeners, to remind people, I'm presuming that you've listened. If you haven't listened, Jeff Platt wrote a book about the case. Obviously, he was interviewed by Ray D'Arcy, and it was kind of looked upon as a truthful account of what happened. And I think the podcast kind of shook that story up a bit. And there was a moment where Robert went into the cafe and had a chat with him, and suddenly things started to get a bit spaced out. And I think what I'd like to hear is your own account. And like, that's the one part of journalism that it doesn't appeal to me, sitting in a cafe where you're like, no, this lad has gone somewhere else, and you're going, okay, what's going to happen next?
Yeah. No, I mean, it was kind of a bizarre, I suppose it was a bizarre encounter, because you're going to meet somebody and you're presenting to them and they're presenting to you, I suppose you think in good faith or whatever. And, I suppose we recorded with this ex-policeman, this ex kind of English policeman, for nearly 4 hours, because originally he was the guy who had, information on Kelly, because he worked as a runner on the Kelly case. He wasn't a detective, but he used to bring Kieran Kelly to and from court for his hearings. So he reckoned that, it was during these trips in the van that Kelly kind of told him a lot of these stories about his crimes. But then obviously when he was kind of given his recollections of that period, it just, I suppose, started going off piste, and started going into kind of, just the bizarre, really.
Yeah, but there was still that conflict for yourself where you're thinking there probably is some truth there, and it's to try and push away the other stuff, to get to the truth.
Yeah, no, and I think I suppose it's just Jeff's account, I suppose, Jeff Platt's account, is trying to distill kind of through it what was important and what could be discounted, and we've been 4 years trying to do that. So,
like, just from my perspective, like listening to the podcast, I felt a little bit unsatisfied, and it's nothing to do with the podcast; it's to do with the story. Hence the other 2 episodes, because because of the information you have at your disposal, because of everything, you can't say this is what happened. Fact, it can't be that simple. So, because again, it's not fact. Fact is harder to simplify than fiction. So, in your at the end of the current podcast that's just been out, what do we know about what he did, factually?
So I think, I guess for your listeners, an easy way, I suppose, of trying to sum it up is that our investigation was a numbers game, really. How many people did Kieran Kelly actually kill? Because
that was your starting point, was it?
That was the starting point. That's kind of what we set out to try and work out. His story, he was reported in the British press as a serial killer. Jeff Platt, who we just mentioned, was really the voice of the Kelly story then. He attributed multiple murders, into double figures to Kelly. And basically we kind of took off trying to figure out, what's real and what's not. And I guess at the end of the series, at the end of part 6, we, based on the information and everything we found, we try and give our position on it. the best we can, because obviously, as we're saying earlier, there's those gaps because of the time period these crimes were being committed in, and
yes,
and and I'm sure people who will be listening to your series on as well will, it's kind of a very Irish thing, or maybe not just exclusively Irish, but people with nicknames. I mean, I'd have friends in London now who I'd go for a pint with, or friends from being in the pub who I'd know by nickname only.
Yeah.
And obviously Kelly's world was in, the commons and grasslands and drinking outside in London.
Yeah.
And London was transient, so a lot of people in his world, went by nicknames, and he went by a nickname. So
yeah,
you're trying to go back and figure out,
yeah, it's tough work.
admissions of murder, like attributed to somebody who had a nickname, and what's the real name. And so when it got to the end of the series, we just had to be honest with, like, this is what we found. This is how we feel about it now.
Yeah.
And if you open Kieran Kelly's file right now, you'll see a conviction for manslaughter and you'll see a conviction for murder.
Yeah.
So his legal counsel, could argue with some force that, that's all he did.
Yeah.
That's what's on his record. But I think if you've listened to the series, I think there's a strong case for other people dying at Kelly's hands. And, can we say so emphatically? Possibly not. I suppose you don't feel under pressure to do that either, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
There's other people who've come in and said, we would have hoped, like, for more kind of clarity on certain cases, but there is new stuff coming. I would say that.
It's not going to leave you alone yet. Just before we move on from the Nobody Zone, one question I have for you is, in your opinion, how if he did more than the murders he's accused of, or the manslaughter he's accused of, how much of it was premeditated and how much of it was just influenced by his drinking?
I probably think myself that Kieran Kelly was probably a schizophrenic, and I think he had he was kind of both quick-tempered, and his temper would kind of manifest in extreme violence. So I don't think possibly any of the murder would have been kind of well thought out. I think it would have been a lot of people he was attacking, or who suffered violence at the hands of Kieran Kelly, were from his world, and this was a world of high anxiety, high addiction, paranoia, people kind of essentially living in a conflict zone where ruled by kind of drinking drugs, and
in a time when there was no real help there available for people like him.
So I think in that world there was violence anyway, not just perpetrated by Kieran Kelly, but there was a kind of huge fear. He had a huge aura and persona in that world, and we've spoken to people kind of since who said that if they knew Kelly was kind of drinking somewhere, they wouldn't be there, they'd be somewhere else because of his propensity for violence.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the Nobody Zone is available in all platforms, and congratulations, by the way, on the podcast of the year and the IMRO Awards.
Listen, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Owen, for giving it a plug and talking about it. And
so let's. Do you have a time to move on to another podcast you're involved in?
Listen, of course, yeah.
Right. Okay. I mean, the plan for those who are listening is to, this is the Kildare Speaks podcast, and to talk to you about Kildare. But then you get into this. I think, I know that there's going to be people who's using this podcast as a way to kind of, to understand the Nobody Zone better. And it's an opportunity and for me as well, to ask you questions about it. So I couldn't help it. Sure. But you were born in Naas, is that right?
Grew up my whole life in Naas, yeah. Moved into Lakeland across from the hospital in 1978, and my mum and dad still live there, same house. So 40 and 42 now, so they're 42 years in that house, yeah.
And you were doing a little piece for the Leinster Leader for a while.
Yeah, I wrote a regular column for the Leader. Kind of, I had an editor there I worked with in England, Ronan